Welcome to Laurier's Teaching Excellence Conversation Series. I'm Deborah Veninaton, Academic Director of Teaching Excellence and Innovation at Wilfrid Laurier University. Today, I'm with Lisa Kuron from Laurier's Leadership Program. She received the 2023 Early Career Excellence Award in Teaching. In just over 5 years at Laurier, Lisa has become an integral part of the fabric of the leadership program. She is a deeply student-centered educator whose compassionate approach to teaching crafts a sense of belonging in her courses and inspires her students and colleagues to explore and grow. Lisa is committed to enhancing EDI through her teaching, and she uses innovative and impactful approaches that create diverse and personalized learning experiences for students. She also deeply embeds experiential learning opportunities into her courses, helping students build and showcase their learning, and I'm excited to talk with her today about her approach to teaching. So Lisa, I really want to start by talking to you about your approach to teaching, because in your nomination package, you really talk about the guide on the side. Tell us why you take that approach in the classroom.
Absolutely. I mean, the short and simple version is that it's fun. It's a lot more fun, I think, to involve the students in that conversation. Certainly I could be that expert, that sage on the stage and talk at them for 80 minutes for 3 hours, but it's kind of boring to do it that way.
Yeah.
And, I'm fortunate to be a leadership educator, so I've got lots of leadership theories that talk about that importance of including other people's voice. And we know, of course, from a pedagogical perspective that that's important too. And so for theoretical reasons, it's really important to build students' confidence in that way. And from a leadership perspective, we talk a lot about it depends. There's no right way to lead. There's no right way to follow. There's no right way to be. So what does it depend on? We have to have conversations about those nuances and how your perspective's different than mine, which means I'll probably have to adapt. And without that conversation, it's just one perspective, mine, which isn't enough. And again, it's kind of boring.
It's really, I like that right at the beginning of your nomination package when you talk about, you let them in on the secret in the first class, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit about the secret.
Yeah, I find that students come to learning and they're often looking for that one right answer. What do you want me to say? What is the right answer? And I tell them very early on, the secret to everything you need to know about leadership is it depends. I said, if on an exam you wrote down the answer, it depends, then you told me a little bit more of what it depends on. I said, you're on the right track. That's the answer. And so our job is to know that it depends and then to work through our critical thinking. So it depends on who we are as leaders. It depends on what our
discover, who are you as a leader?
Exactly.
Right?
It depends on the context that we're in, right? If we're in a high stress environment, that's a lot different than a lower stakes environment. It depends on who's in the space with us, all of these things. So how can we take that information and really intentionally make our next choices rather than just react out of emotions?
So then what's happening in the classroom when you're the guide on the side? Like, what do you see happening sort of around you and beside you and happening for the students?
What I try to see is, that student engagement with each other, those student to student connections. They're having conversations. I hear a lot of, well, if it was me, this is what I'd see. And then someone's, well, if it was me, this is what I would say. And
which is exactly where you're headed.
Exactly, right? And I sort of pop in, I said, that's exactly right. So if this person believes this and this next person believes that, how do you create a space for both of these people to be successful, or both of these people to thrive, or both of these people to, get what you're trying to give them, right? It's hard, and it's about intentionality and not this one size fits all. How do we adapt in that moment?
And yet you must be using a common language with them, right? Because if you're encouraging them to discover who they are as leaders, right? There must be some touchstones in the class for them, right? That they can,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, we've got our textbook and we've got those keywords, and right at the start of the slides I'll always, here's the keywords that I want to use, and this is our shared language as us as a community. So these are the words that I want to hear back because this is common to us all. So we can make sense of these things together. And so certainly like
Yeah.
let's focus on that common language. That's our starting point. But then how we see things can be different. We talk about confidence, for example. It's one of the traits we know leaders have, but even the way we conceptualize confidence is different around people, different based on the person. And so,
Oh, for sure.
right,
Yeah.
unpacking
Yeah.
some of those things. For some people, confidence is I feel confident no matter what situation I'm in that I can do it. And I encourage students, well, what if confidence is just the willingness to try, knowing that you could fail, but you can try anyways because we have the confidence to learn. And so it's not about coming in with confidence that I can do this right the
Yeah.
first time, but I can do this wrong and still be okay.
So what inspired this approach? Because, oftentimes, we teach or we start off teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I think that describes me. We start off teaching the way we learned, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was going through, everything was lecture based, and you
Mm-hmm.
sat in the class, you took in, right? There were seminars at the upper levels, but it was very kind of lecture based. And so when I started teaching, I started doing what I had been taught.
Mm-hmm.
So did you have somebody model this approach for you, or is this
On
no?
Yeah, honestly,
No,
no. I was a very passive learner, to be honest. When I was an undergraduate student, I
that's
sat,
very hard
yeah,
to that's very hard to picture,
right?
actually. Yeah.
I almost never participated. And now these are the expectations that I'm putting on my students, which is really interesting. I often wonder, would past Lisa have participated in my classes today? And I don't know if
So
she
do
would
you
have.
tell them that
I do,
story?
absolutely.
That must be very inspiring for them
I hope
because they're
so.
thinking, hey, this is who my professor is
Yeah.
now. And
Right? Well, and I think, they see a professor and they have all these connotations on what it means to be a professor. And, we're confident, we're experts, and we don't make mistakes, etc. But we do. We're humans, right? We're humans
yeah,
who happen to be professors. So, especially with my first year students, I try to share some of my most embarrassing stories as a first year to have that vulnerability, to have that humility, and help them feel okay making mistakes because
and that you're human too. Yeah.
exactly that I am human as well. And so when I was an undergrad, it was very much like you were saying, that lecture based. I was pretty passive. I was a good student, but I wouldn't say I was an engaged student.
Yeah.
And so
And now
and now
all of your teaching is, engagement and experiential and yeah.
exactly. And so, just recognizing my power to create an environment where people can engage and feel comfortable taking risks, all of these different things. How can I intentionally craft that space and make it more fun? Because fundamentally, I love learning. I think it's so
Yeah.
much fun. From a young age, I've always been good at learning. And so it's always been fun for me. But I know it's not been fun for everybody else. So, how can I create that environment where learning is less about performance and more about that experience, that process of becoming better versions of ourselves?
It's funny, I always tell students, I loved being at university so much and I loved learning so much
Mm-hmm.
that I never left.
Exactly, right? Here
And
we
then
are,
you're
we're
kind of like,
still here.
oh, that's true. Got constant lifelong learning.
Mm-hmm.
We're here today in Laurier's Circle Room, which is an Indigenous community space here at Brantford campus. And in education, certainly circles and circle pedagogy, it changes the way people relate to one
Mm-hmm.
another and the way they interact with one another, right? So you can do different things in the classroom and
Mm-hmm.
with teaching and learning that you might not otherwise do. So are there things that are there ways in which you use classroom spaces, to do different kinds of things in your classes?
Absolutely. I mean, even when I'm lecturing, because of course I can't just be always the guide on the side, I've got to build that foundational
Yeah,
knowledge
yeah,
too. Whether it's at the start of class or as I'm lecturing, I'm a wanderer at heart. I
yeah,
like to
too.
move up
Yeah,
around, and especially in those big lecture halls, to connect with the students who are in the back row, who are maybe trying to hide a little bit. I use name cards in the class, so as I'm walking around, that allows me to learn the students' names.
So I don't mean to
Yeah,
interrupt you,
please.
but I really noticed in your nomination package, there was a quote from a student that said, by the second or third class, you've learned everybody's name in a class of 100. Tell us how you do that, because I'm sure a bunch of our colleagues would love to know how you do that. That's very difficult.
It is very difficult. Honestly, it's in part just how my brain works. My brain's really good at
Oh, you're
remembering
lucky.
names and connecting to faces. But what I try to do is I use name tags, but I collect those every class. So I'll put them out and I'll tell the students, I'm using these because I want to know who you are. I want
Oh,
to,
so you give them out and then
yeah.
they wear them?
No,
Or
so it's
put
like
them
on the desk.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And I said, and I want you to have these every day in front of you because I want to know who you are.
Right.
And
Right.
when I'm calling on them, I'll use their name, as often as possible while I'm wandering around to eavesdrop on conversations and to guide those conversations. I'm sort of always checking back in with the name tags. I'll sort of test myself sometimes where the name tag will be there, but I won't look at it. I'm like, okay, that person is. So I kind of make it a game for myself, but it's also just the way that my brain works, and then these supports that I have built in to help me learn their names. And honestly, it makes such a difference. I've got to tell you, like you said, in the nomination package, I had that quote about how powerful it is to just be seen, as a human being
She
and
actually
not
knew
as a
my
number.
name, even though I'm
Yeah.
in this large lecture, right? Yeah.
And I think taking that anonymity out from the students is really powerful, so that
It's
they
like step one in
exactly
pedagogies of care, but we'll get onto that as well.
absolutely. So in terms of how I use the space, like I said, I'm wandering around quite a lot. And as you were saying with the circle room, how the desks foster that collaboration, especially when we're in active learning classrooms. I teach a fourth year hands-on leadership class. And so the first thing that we'll do every class, it's a norm, we rearrange the desks into 3 small different groups because we know we're working in 3 groups every single class. So let's move that classroom space in order to do that. We're often doing problem solving exercises in our leadership courses. And so sometimes the desk is a problem, right? We don't have enough space to do the task that we want to do.
Oh, gee. Yeah.
Right? So, well, what can we change? If we can't change the desk, can we change our orientation, right? How do we work with the space that we find ourselves in? So introducing it as part of that context, as part of that problem to be solved, using it in that way. I've also had students, I teach a diversity class as well. So we'll talk about how, because leadership is sort of everywhere,
Yeah.
I'll give them 20 to 30 minutes to explore the building and to come back reporting, what did you see that was inclusive? What did you see that maybe has some concerns about the space that we're in?
Oh, really? So they
yeah.
leave the classroom, go around, reflect, come back and share?
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's great.
So they'll notice things like there's certain classes that don't have the accessibility button to enter, or students notice that there were no baby change tables, or if there were, it was only in the women's washroom and not in the men's. And so why is that? And let's unpack and sort of work backwards and use our environment as that case study, as that learning tool for us for that day.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Sounds like fun too.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And it gets them out and it gets them moving. And what I hope it also does is while they're navigating the world outside of our classroom, they're on the lookout for those things as well.
It's funny because one of the findings of the classroom survey that Teaching Excellence and Innovation did was that, what instructors and students want is, even if it's a large class, they want to be able to move around and interact. So how do we create classroom spaces that even when you have 100 or 250, right, or more, that you can still interact in a way, right, and engage with one another.
And sometimes it's just those really small things, right? If I'm going to have them do a think, pair, share, rather than report back orally, I'll sometimes send them to the front of the room to get a large Post-it, and they have to get up and walk to the room, get the Post-it, put the Post-it up somewhere, then we can walk around and look at everyone's work, right? And we could just have open conversation, but recognizing that need to move around and mill about and, activate our minds and our bodies. This is just a small twist on that I think also forces them to think a little deeper because they've got to write it down. They can't just on the fly be like, oh yeah, this is what we talked about.
Yeah, That's right.
Mhm.
More intentional
Exactly.
in their practice. If I can just change gears a little bit, I would say that one thing that comes through really strongly in your package is the focus on inclusivity
Mhm.
and enabling, engaging, empowering a diversity of voices. And you
Mhm.
do that, it's almost a full court press because you've got it going in your course design,
Mhm.
in the classroom physically, and in your own research
Mhm.
as well. Conference presentations, scholarship on teaching and learning. So, you know, you've made all of those different spheres of our profession sort of come
Mhm.
together in such a way that you're trying to promote this in different ways. In the classroom, what are some of the ways that you try to sort of create and scaffold a sense of place where everybody feels like they belong, right? No matter what kind of diversity you've got in your classroom.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think a really great part of your question there is that emphasis on that scaffolding, right? We can't start big. As I mentioned, I was a passive student. I wasn't participating, in part because I didn't think it mattered. I didn't think the teacher wanted to hear me. I didn't think the student wanted to hear me. So leveraging that experience and knowing what are some of the things that are holding students back and how can I counterbalance that? And so I really start big picture. And I let students know on the first day, I actually want you to be successful. My role here is to support you in not only understanding the course content, but also in applying it. And so I am
Yeah.
here to guide you through that. And I want to make it explicitly clear to them that I want the class as a whole to be successful. And just having that message as that foundation, I think holds me accountable to actually doing it now, right? I've said it out loud, and now I'm going to have to do
You
that.
set the agenda.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then finding those little spaces where we can scaffold up, right? Because it's scary. It's scary to answer a question on diversity or inclusion or problem solving or conflict management. You don't want to be wrong. So rather than starting with content questions, we often start class with silly little check-in questions. Where there's no right or wrong answer. It's just a way to practice getting your voice out there. And maybe we spend 5 minutes of class sort of breaking the ice, if you will.
So what are the kinds of things that you ask them?
You know, we start sort of silly because then people are, you know, it just breaks that first barrier. My usual first starting question is, what's your favorite way to eat a potato?
I could think of lots of different, I can see how you could start a
Yeah.
conversation on that. Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
great.
And, you know, a question as innocent as that reveals more information than just the potato. I've had students who
And
say,
getting people talking who might not otherwise,
exactly,
want
right?
to
Someone
do
says
that.
pierogies, and I happen to be Polish, so then I've let it slip. I connect with that. You know, I'm actually Polish, and every year my brother and I make pierogies together. And someone's, I love pierogies, and you know, we're building that connection. And you know, of course, students get a little bit hungry when we're talking about that too. But students get excited for these.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
like, what effect does this have on students?
Yeah.
It must, really set the tone for a lot more interaction and
Absolutely. And as the
engagement.
semester proceeds, sometimes we'll set the check-in questions a little bit more relevant to the time of year as we're approaching midterms. Where's your favorite place to study on campus? And so now it's not just about sharing your perspective, but sharing with your community. Actually, you know, here's somewhere on campus that if you haven't been, or where's your favorite place to eat on campus? You know, things like that. So we're building
that's
connections
nice.
between the students. And then as we move even a little bit further, if we have a group project, we'll ask things like, when do you do your best work? Is it in the morning, the afternoon, the evening? And so that information is useful for groups to know for each
Absolutely.
other
Yeah.
as
yeah.
well. So I try to be very intentional, even in the questions that I ask in that small way.
But you must have to address some difficult issues,
Abs-
especially in your diversity course. So how do you do that? I mean, obviously you're setting the groundwork there so that people feel safe, they feel, secure in terms of, lending their voice, et cetera. But how do you have some of those more difficult conversations?
You know, I think it's sort of setting that stage or setting that tone early on. One of the things that we'll do is after we've had a few days of practice speaking out loud together is we'll co-create some classroom norms of, you know, these are some regulations that we're going to agree to abide by in
Right.
terms of being open to different opinions, not shutting people down, recognizing that there's lots of different ways to live,
Is
your
that a
life.
hard conversation to have? It's funny because another thing that teaching excellence and
Mhm.
innovation is doing is having the faculty learning community on
Mhm.
challenging classroom conversations. Well, that relates to that as well,
Mhm.
right?
It can be, especially because students want that one right answer. And so when you
Yeah,
tell
they
them,
really do.
they really do, right?
Yeah.
And so when you tell them that, Deborah's perspective is going to be different than mine, and that's natural, and you allow for those both to be right at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think what I try to do is set the stage with my own humility. I share with them very openly some of the mistakes that I've made, some of the bias that I've caught myself engaging in. And that's really scary. But if we're going to do something about it, we have to have that awareness.
Yeah.
And so I see my responsibility is to model the way. If I'm going to expect it from the students, I've got to sort of set that stage.
And do they follow through?
They do. But it's all voluntary. The other thing I tell them is I'm never going to cold call you because I don't want to force you to share vulnerable information. It's not my place to know your story. If you want to share that with me, I very much welcome and I will listen intently and, validate that experience for you, but I won't force it out of you.
Interesting.
So I think not cold calling, building that relationship creates that space where people are like, no, my point is valid. And my experience is valid, even if it's completely different from somebody
From
else.
what I'm hearing across the room.
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
I think the other way, because I don't want to always expect the students to lead those conversations, is bringing in challenging conversations that are happening at the societal level. Whether it's about changing names of institutions or, some of the struggles
Indeed,
that are
yeah.
happening during the pandemic, right? We have the whole world as sort of our case study in terms of leadership, right? So we can bring some of those in and talk a little bit about why this person has a different perspective from that person, or why we might want to start doing things differently.
So then what do you see, like the changes from the beginning of your course to the end
Mhm.
of the course in terms of students engaging, sometimes, on tough issues?
Yeah, I think just the willingness to engage and to be open to the nuances and the complexities a little bit more. I see students really feel empowered by owning their story and owning who they are, their strengths, their limitations, in terms of that, and being willing to be more passionate in sharing that, but also in taking a step back and knowing that their perspective isn't the only one. It's one and it's very important, but so is everyone else's in that room. And so I love
Yeah.
to see them supporting each other when someone shares a story and a student will raise their hand, and building on that person's point. I'm seeing those connections between them as
Right,
they're
right.
building on each other's ideas. Even though their ideas are different, they're still in some ways connected.
Yeah. Another way in which you have really fostered a sense of inclusivity in the
Mhm.
classroom is by completely changing your diversity in the workplace course,
Mhm.
right? To a course that's co-taught with our colleague Erin Hudson,
Yes.
right? Who's an educational developer and an expert in terms of indigenizing curriculum
Mhm.
and also an instructor at Laurier for a number of years, right?
Mhm.
So what does co-teaching look like,
Mhm.
for the two of you in the classroom?
Honestly, it can be different depending on the day. Very,
Yeah,
very
yeah.
early on in that the relationship, we were working very hands-on together to prepare learning materials, to prepare the assessments, the course outline. So it was
It's
really,
a lot of
yeah,
negotiation.
it is.
It's a lot of negotiation.
It's a negotiation and it's a collaboration and it fundamentally is a partnership. And for us, what's really important is it's not a partnership that's based on a 50-50 equal split. This is what fairness means. For us, it's very much rooted in equity, recognizing that as human beings, sometimes your capacity is lower on some days versus others. Or sometimes your expertise isn't there, but great, guess what? You have this great colleague who's in that
Absolutely, yeah,
space,
yeah.
right? And so sometimes it's us working together and building off each other's points. Sometimes it's us stepping back and letting the other person lead the way. Sometimes it's both of us stepping back and encouraging the students to lead the way. But what's really important for us is, and why I wanted to initiate that structural change, is because, again, my voice is only one in the classroom.
Yeah.
If we're going to celebrate diversity, then how do we bake that diversity into the structure of the course? And in class, we talk a lot about standpoint plurality, having multiple different standpoints and perspectives. And so Erin and I can and often do come at an issue from different perspectives. And by sharing that with the class, we can show them and tell them that the standpoint plurality is worthwhile and this is why we need it and this is how you manage it.
Yeah, and it doesn't
Mhm.
paralyze collaboration. You
No.
just, here's how you work through it.
Exactly. And
Right.
it can actually strengthen the collaboration because maybe I don't see something that Erin sees a different way. And Erin can educate me on that. And then we reach a totally new direction than we ever would have
Yeah.
if it was just me or just Erin.
So it's funny because at Laurier, I hear lots of voices say, you know, we should do more co-teaching or team teaching. What's your advice to your colleagues, you know, across the Laurier campus who want to co-teach? Like, what are some areas that are a little murkier and maybe things that, you know, that you could avoid?
Well, I think with anything, there are risks, right? Anytime you're entering a relationship with someone else, there's
Yeah, and
both,
you need the right someone else, right?
and you don't always know who that person's going to be.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I'll be honest, when we initiated that change for us, I didn't know who that other person was going to be. We knew it was going to be a contract faculty member. So who's going to come out on the other side of the hiring process? I had no idea. And I have to tell you, that was scary.
Okay, I didn't realize
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
What if we don't match? What if we, you know, have different approaches? What if our pedagogies, you know, are completely opposite from one another? But I had belief in, you know, the pedagogy behind it, the foundation behind it.
Yeah.
And so I jumped in and I took the risk and it's worked out really wonderfully.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest reason it's worked is because Erin and I have very honest conversations. We have honest conversations.
Don't let things fester.
Exactly. Don't let things fester.
Yeah.
You know, what does fairness look like? Is this a 50-50 relationship? And being very honest that it can't be a 50-50 relationship.
Yeah.
Because we have different contexts. We have our life outside of work that sometimes will
Interfere.
interfere.
Absolutely.
So how do we manage those conversations? And I think just being open and talking about your pedagogical style early on and finding those opportunities where they really align well together, finding the opportunity to center your co-teaching colleague and celebrate them. Erin and I try to celebrate each other in front of the class as well, because that's how you build community.
That's nice.
Right?
That's very nice. So in terms of relationship building, what's a good exercise for relationship building when you're embarking on a, you know,
on a co-teaching relationship? Oh, that's that's a really good question.
To get to know them off the bat,
Yeah.
right? And sort of kick those conversations to a deeper level.
You know, I think even if you started with some of those silly little check-in questions, right? And, you know,
what do you like to do?
What do you like to do? Kind of like a job interview. Tell me a little bit about yourself. And, you know, find those pieces where you do share connection. Erin and I are very similar in that we take that student-centered approach, right? So those were the pieces that when we found those commonalities, this is where that's going to be the foundation.
Then you're thinking, okay.
Exactly. This is the foundation of our teaching approach, and we'll build from there. And anywhere where we had, I wouldn't say disagreements, but just different perspectives, we'll figure out how we're going to manage that. Will you take the lead? Will I take the lead? Will we compromise? Will we experiment? Will we give the students options? There's always multiple answers to experiment with. But meanwhile,
the students have a front row seat to this and are seeing, you know, all of this.
Absolutely.
Relationship development and working things through. And I'm sure
Absolutely.
they love it.
Well, and from a leadership education perspective, that's really important. They have to learn how to work with other people, people who are different than them, people who have different priorities or, you know, backgrounds than them. And how can you do it? You can do it well with humility and honesty.
If I can I'm just going to change course a little bit. I want to talk about experiential learning because that's another real strength in your nomination package. You integrate experiential learning into so many aspects of your
Mhm.
courses, and I wish we could talk about them all, but the most
Mhm.
spectacular is that you actually train students in the fourth year course to
Mhm.
participate in the Collegiate Leadership Challenge.
Mhm.
Tell us what this is. So I had never heard of
Mhm.
this. And then reading through it, then I went and looked online and got really excited about it.
Mhm.
So how did this start? And, what does it look like in the confines of the course that you're training students to do this?
Absolutely. Well, I have to give credit in terms of how it started to my colleague, Dr. Chris Gearhart, in leadership. He met our colleague, Dr. Scott Allen, who's down at John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio. And Scott had this idea that we can talk about leadership all we want and have a great time doing it, but there's talking about it and then there's actually doing it. So how do we create this space where students are doing it and learning more about themselves and collaborating with other people in the process? So he had this sort of idea of what would a leadership Olympics look like?
Oh, I love it. I love it.
And so, branching off of that, we have this course, OL 401, Leadership Skills, Practice and Application, and it is for our upper year students who have that baseline knowledge of leadership.
Yeah.
And our entire curriculum is about 30 pages long. It is course content summarized into acronyms, and all of those acronyms stand for something. For example, we solve a lot of problems. So SOLVE is one of our acronyms. And the acronyms are meant to help us be more intentional in that moment when we're solving problems, when the emotions could get the best of us. And the acronyms sort of force us to slow down and be like, oh yeah, how do we do this? Well, solve. So we set roles and clarify goals. That's the S. Then we outline the problem, the O. Then we list multiple strategies, veer towards consensus, and evaluate results, which will circle us back to the top because we might have to do some more things as we've evaluated. And so we have this content that is meant to be practiced. So we put students in different situations every single class. We maybe have 20, 30 minutes of like content delivery, and the rest of the 3-hour period is do an activity with a team. Sometimes you're leading, sometimes you're
And
following.
it's problem solving kind of, how do you deal with this? And the intent is to participate in the CLC, right?
So not all of the students will participate in the
Okay.
CLC. We do put forth one team from both the Waterloo and the Brantford campus. We could do more if enough students sort of stepped forward. But we normally have a class about 24 students, and then 6 will represent Laurier at this competition. So we spend the 12 weeks giving that experiential experience to all of the students. And we call it deliberate practice. We're going to push you outside of your comfort zone so you can learn more
Oh,
about
yeah.
yourself, so you can give feedback to people and say, you know what, that really didn't work for me, so that you can learn how to be more adaptive in your style.
And then what happens at the actual competition?
At the actual competition, so we have shifted to online because, of course, that's the world that we live in right now. But
Oh, too bad they don't go in person.
we do. So we do have
Yeah.
a more informal event. It's going to be held in March here on the Brantford campus.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it's a smaller scale. We have about 9 to 10 teams from colleges and universities from within Ontario. They come here to do it. But the big formal event is about 40 teams from across North America. And every team has been studying that curriculum for about 10 to 12 weeks. And it culminates in a 2-day event, 3 events on the Thursday, 3 events on the Saturday. And every event you get scored on. You get scored on your process. How do you solve problems and work together as a team? Which we always advocate. You can control the process. You can't always control the results, but you can control your behaviors through your intentional choices.
Absolutely.
And that's really what the course is trying to get them to do.
Because you've schooled them in, right? Here's your
Exactly.
process.
Exactly.
Practicing this, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Sometimes you're moving too fast here. You need to slow down at this stage of the game. You have to outline the problem more, because if you're solving the wrong problem, you're not going to get the results, right? And so the 100 points for process, 100 points for results. Everybody leads a different activity. We have 6 in teams of 6, so 1 leader per activity. And then, based on your score, where do you finish? And
Laurier does really well.
we did. So last year, the Laurier Brantford team won the in-person competition here at Laurier Brantford. And then in the online competition with about 40 teams, I think we placed 4th and 6th.
Amazing.
Yeah, so very
Amazing.
proud.
So what do you attribute that to?
Honestly, to the
Good training,
process.
good process. Yeah.
To the
Yeah.
process, and really the students' engagement with that process, and their recognition that they can control that.
They must be so thrilled to
Mhm.
participate and then to do well. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
It's such a great test of their skills in a safe environment too.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
it's
yeah.
for the glory,
Yeah.
but it's before they go into the workplace, and this is going to affect their career development, right? And they get to build relationships with their colleagues, and you know, it's fantastic the feedback that we receive from the course, and even my ability to, celebrate students, giving them references. I have this great competition. I said, well, he works great under pressure. Here's an example where I put him in this wild situation, and these are all the steps that he took to
Yeah.
methodically manage it.
It's funny because one of the things that comes through, including from the students that have participated in the CLC in your package, is how surprised students are that professors care.
Mm-hmm.
This is
I know.
something that constantly stuns me.
Mm-hmm.
So where are they getting this, this impression
Mm-hmm.
of professors that, we are uncaring autocrats, right? It's funny. Where's this coming from?
So I actually had a conversation in the diversity class. We were talking about stereotypes. And of course, I didn't want to talk about stereotypes of particular identity groups. So I chose professor. I
Me,
said,
yeah.
right? I said, tell me some stereotypes you've heard about professors, and that they don't care about you, that they're just a number, that their research is the most important thing, that they don't want to be bothered.
Where do they get this from?
So I asked them, and they said, from my parents, from my guidance counselors,
Yeah.
from TV, from movies. There is that very stereotypical way
Representation
that
of
we've
who we
been
are.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so, I think we have to work even harder to show them that we care, to counteract that, because perhaps it's not surprising that they come to class disengaged, because we're scary, right? We're not.
No,
But they don't
I
know
always
that.
I say, I'm not scary. Look at me, listen to me. I'm
No.
not scary. And then they're like, well,
Exactly.
So it's funny. So how at Laurier do we overcome this impression? Because we need to do it as soon as they come,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is something I think about a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we do a great job, at our open house and talking about how much Laurier cares about the student experience. But I think the best touch point is the
In the
professors in the
Yeah,
classroom, the professors
absolutely.
themselves. And going back to what I said, setting the stage of, I want you to succeed. I'm not here trying to sabotage you or trick you on an exam. I actually want you to succeed. That is
Yeah.
my goal. I've done
Yeah.
my job well if each and every one of you is successful. So how can we do that? And so I think that explicit messaging, and then just small ways of humanizing yourself. I've got 2 dogs. I show pictures of them all the time, which is a great stress reliever for
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
But also, it's just a great way to humanize myself. I can tell silly stories about the dogs. One time, one of the dogs needed emergency surgery, and so my emotional well-being was really impacted because I was teaching class while she was having surgery. So I just wasn't, quite there that day.
Yeah.
But I shared that with the students, and the way they showed up for me in that moment when I was a human and modeled that it's okay to be a human being, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's
harder to do in the big classes than in the little classes,
It is.
but important nonetheless.
It is.
Right.
So I think, it's that, setting the tone, finding those small ways to humanize yourself, but also structuring your course in a way that
I was going to say it's also
Yeah.
course design,
yeah,
right?
structuring your course in a way that allows them to make mistakes. Whether it's having the formative assessments, the practice quizzes that don't count for anything, so they can kind of see where they're
They can
at.
gauge
Exactly.
retention and progress.
Or the
Yeah.
best 2 of 4, assessment structures. So if they didn't do so well, they can take that feedback and learn and apply it to the next time. Or even little things like I've created opportunities for students to lead the way. In their first year class, they can choose between participating in class or participating in online discussions. So giving them agency and to choose what's best for them, and letting them know, I'm doing this because I want you to lean into your strengths. I want you to challenge yourself. I want you to do what's best for you, not just fit this mold of what it has to be. It can be whatever we want it to be.
And you know, the things you're talking about, it really is layering on sort of relationship building with pedagogies of care. And, you know, some of the things you've been, you know, choose to do in your courses, it's also universal design for learning,
Exactly.
right? And all of these things that are layered on to create this atmosphere in class where students can, you know, are really well positioned to learn.
Exactly.
Right?
And I
And
think
engage.
if we can get back to that point in education, because I think right now students feel like they have to perform. Kind of like with academics, you have to publish or you perish.
Yeah,
Right?
a lot of our lives are performative.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how do we move away from that performative and refine the joy in learning? Because we chose these disciplines for a reason, because we love them, because we're nerds who really love to get in the nitty-gritty details. So how can we leverage that passion, that excitement to learn and share that with our students?
So is that how you manage to balance your teaching life with your research life with, you know, administrative contributions, right? There's a lot of pieces of our lives, again, that kind of collide at various points. How do you keep your energy and enthusiasm? Because you have a lot.
Yeah, I do. I do. And, you know, I think, like you said, finding those ways where they just fit nicely together.
Yeah.
I think a lot about, you know, these synergies, you're right, that we can sort of meet. And I'm so lucky that I teach leadership and then I'm the leader of the classroom. So if I am looking for direction or ideas of what to do, I can look to the content that I teach. Right? If I want to be more caring, well, I have servant leadership. So, what does the servant leadership theories tell me and what can I implement into that? But I think having
You should be consulting with everybody, you know, for everyone else on campus.
Right?
Here's what you should do.
But I think having that self-reinforcing
Yeah.
ecosystem, right? Having those colleagues who believe in that as well. So sometimes, because, you know, while I have energy and enthusiasm, there's absolutely the times where I'm like, oh, you know, I want to be done or I'm frustrated. But then you surround yourself with people who also care. And, you know, that's another great thing for
So
co-teaching.
that's a self-care tip.
Yeah,
Surround yourself with people who care.
exactly. And it's
Yeah.
also a plug for co-teaching, because if I'm just not feeling it that day or I'm frustrated, I have
Absolutely.
someone to have that sounding block with.
Absolutely.
And I'm not just ruminating on an issue myself. I have someone who can redirect me.
But you also perform that mentoring role for colleagues as
Mhm.
well in terms of supporting them, you know, through difficulties in teaching, et cetera. So,
Absolutely.
and that's again, so you're creating that community, right?
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think that community is so important.
It's funny because one of the things that I often think about is if I think about me 25 years ago when I started teaching and me now, wow, are they different people? But that may not be the case for you, right? How has your teaching practice changed, right? Since, you know, from when you started to the present, or is it just a deepening for you?
I think there's some elements that have changed. I think that the constant has been that student-centered approach to teaching.
Right.
But I will say that early on in my teaching career, I was a lot more rigid.
I think a lot of us start our careers thinking we need to institute structure and be in control of the classroom, and you know, because you don't want to show weakness.
Exactly.
Right? If they sniff out your if they sniff out your weakness, you're finished.
Exactly.
Right?
You have to prove that you belong in this classroom, that you have that
Absolutely.
knowledge, that you
Absolutely.
know it all, that
Mhm.
they can't trip you up. But the fact is, you are going to make mistakes, right? And so I think early in my teaching career, I was very rigid. This is what we were doing, and these are the rules and the boundaries within that, because that's what I experienced. But then as I continued, I realized that this doesn't really work, or this doesn't feel good. I don't like always enforcing these rules when someone has this emergency
Or
situation.
seeming like you know everything and waiting
Exactly.
for somebody to get online and then say, no, that's wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if I want students to recognize that leadership is an ongoing learning process, I need to model that as well, right? So by being less rigid, I think that I've given myself more grace and space to make mistakes and have fun and experiment and take risks, but the same token, giving the students that opportunity to do it as well, which is where they're going to get the most learning from, right? And so finding those ways where not everyone's experience has to be the exact same. Like I said, there's opportunities for students to do a final exam or a project in my classes where they get to set the terms of the project. I'm there to guide them, but I'm trusting that their expertise, that their passion is going to lead them to a viable path. And I'll help them shape it, but they're the leaders. I couldn't have imagined doing that early in my career. I would have been like, nope, you have to do what this person's doing because that's the only thing that's fair.
Yeah.
But that's just not true. And I think we have these sort of conceptual blocks in our head of what teaching has to be.
Well, I think we're kind of trained that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? It's almost unlearning in order to, create better learning.
Exactly. So I think, really reflecting on we've all been learners too. We've all been that student at the undergraduate level, at the graduate level. Reflect on your experiences. What didn't work? You don't have to do those things. I thought we had to, but you don't have to do those things.
That's probably a good segue into the final question that I wanted to ask you. So here you are already an early career teaching excellence winner, right? So what's next? What's next on the horizon?
I think that's a really great question. I hope that there's a lot of things on the horizon, but two things that I'm really looking at are ungrading. So, this idea of bringing that joy back into learning and doing it for the intrinsic motivation, less so for the performance, but also a little bit of a create your own adventure. Like, what do you want to get through this? Recognizing that our learners are different. I'd love to experiment with that a little bit more. And I'd also really like to experiment on the online space a lot. We have
Yes, because you teach online, you teach in different forums in person and also online.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think I've really found some some great ways to build those relationships and foster that inclusion in the in-person classroom. It's harder to do it online.
Absolutely.
There's an inherent disconnect. And I think some students choose online classrooms intentionally for that. They want that more passive. They need it for whatever their circumstance. But I also know that there's students in those online spaces craving more connection, craving more touch points. So how can we create the online space in a way that meets the needs of both of those groups of learners or recognizes more learners and create the online space to be engaging without overburdening the students. And I've experimented with this a few small ways, but I'd like to dive a lot deeper into that.
Okay, well, that's already a pretty packed agenda.
I like to keep busy.
I really enjoyed our discussion today, Lisa. Thanks so much for joining me here in the Circle Room at Brantford.
Thanks so much for having me, Deborah.
My thanks to Lisa Kuron for joining me today, and I hope you will join me for more conversations that celebrate exceptional teaching practices, explore diverse teaching philosophies, and discuss the future of higher education teaching and learning.